If there's a war, Taiwan shuts down. Who depends more on chips made in Taiwan? Is it us or is it China?
If there's one key factor securing American economic prosperity and military superiority, it's not oil. It's not even weapons. It's chips. Chips power everything from our military machinery to our smartphones that are glued to our hands. Until recently, the US had dominance in crafting the fastest chips in the world. But countries like Taiwan, and more importantly China, are catching up fast.
This is technology that everyone uses, but it's technology that governments have played a major role in shaping.
This unfolding race will determine our future. And it's been thoroughly chronicled by today's exceptionally interesting guest, Chris Miller, in his book aptly titled Chip War. Chris is a professor of international history with a focus on the Cold War. He's devoted much of his life to this study. Let's get into it.
Everybody out there, welcome to a very, very special episode of the Into the Impossible podcast, requested by my brother-in-law because he loves this book by Chris Miller called Chip War. So we're going to go to war today. We're going to talk about this wonderful, really incredible runaway bestseller of 2023 by Chris Miller. Or maybe it came out in 2022. Did it come out in 22 or 23?
That's right, late 2022.
Late 2022, okay. It's been a year of just accolades and encomia from all over the world. And we're going to get into deep dive into the technology, into the physics. You know, Chris, I might be the first person that you've ever talked to on a podcast that's actually done lithography, that's made actual semiconductor and superconductor. These are superconducting detectors we used in my bicep experiment. This is a lithograph proto circuit for an antenna that we used in the Polar Bear 2 experiment, which is ongoing in the Atacama Desert. We're going to talk about diffraction, lithography, some of the cool stuff being done here in San Diego and in Europe. But first, we're going to do what you're never, ever, under any circumstance, supposed to do, which is to judge a book by its cover, especially one as delightful as this. Now, we're going to hold up a fake book. I'm going to hold up my iPhone that has, I listened to the book on audiobook form. Chris, tell us, what was the genesis, the origin of the wonderful cover and the title, especially the subtitle of your fabulous new book?
The title Chip War emerged, actually, it wasn't my first choice for title. It emerged after discussions with my editor, who was brilliant, I think, at encapsulating a book's argument. I was initially actually planning to call the book The Switch, with a reference to transistors turning circuits on and off. But my editor said, no, that doesn't get the thesis of the book. And the thesis is about the contest for controlling this technology. And indeed, one of the themes that emerged from the research was the role of the defense industrial base and pushing forward semiconductor technology. And so that's how we settled on Chip War, referencing the military origins, but also the battle between companies and countries for this technology. And so the cover, at least the U.S. cover, the international editions all have different covers, but the U.S. cover has an American flag juxtaposed next to a semiconductor, which speaks to the fact that this is technology that everyone uses, but it's technology that governments have played a major role in shaping its development.
And the international copy that I saw is of a globe or a map or something like that?
That's right, yeah. It's a picture of a globe with kind of circuitry carved into it.
Yes, and this was very reminiscent. That's why I brought my own circuit board here. Reminiscent of what we do in the laboratory and how we use these sensors. And I want to take us back to maybe the OG of all things digital, and switches, as you mentioned, transistors, and that is, of course, none other than Gordon Moore, who passed away not too long ago. Sadly, because he was an incredible supporter, not just of applied science, but of basic science, pure research. I want to get into that with you, but I want to get your reaction to this quote from Gordon Moore. He said, allegedly, he said, if the automobile industry had set a pace similar to that of the semiconductor industry, a Rolls-Royce would get 500,000 miles per gallon, and it would be cheaper to throw it away than to park it. Is that still true, Chris? Are we still progressing at a rate anticipated by Moore's law, even if the exponent has changed or the base period has changed?
Pretty much. There's different ways you can define and assess Moore's law, but the basic intuition that we're getting dramatically more computing power every couple of years at dramatically reduced cost holds true, which is why you can go on Amazon and buy a thumb drive with 1 billion transistors. For not that much money. And that would have been unthinkable, not just 50 years ago, but 30 years ago, 20 years ago. That was a mind-bogglingly large number. And that still basically holds, which is why everyone is racing to get their hands on the next generation NVIDIA chips to train bigger and bigger AI systems, is because the next generation is better and better at a really extraordinary rate. And I think if you think of the rest of the economy, the rest of society, the rest of technology, nothing else comes close to that sustained rate of improvement over time. The only thing that really compares is the cost and speed of gene sequencing, which has fallen really dramatically the past couple of decades. But Moore's law has been in operation now for over half a century, and it's really unparalleled in all of human history.
Hey, fellow wanderers into the impossible. I hope this deep dive into the semiconductor world is as fascinating to you as it was to me. But there's an important conversation to be had that goes deep beyond this, and I want you to be a part of it. So please do me the favor of subscribing to the channel or following it if you're listening on audio platforms. And for extra credit homework, give me a thumbs up, review, like, comment, share it. Really helps with the algorithm that these computer chips are running in the background to really boost our mission to connect millions of minds around the world of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And by doing so, you'll help me help you get the greatest possible guest on Into the Impossible. Now back to the episode with Chris.
Yeah, and the connection between gene sequencing and also the microchip and semiconductor revolution is really highlighted as well, especially here in San Diego. We have Illumina. And I just interviewed Craig Ventner, who is a Venter, who's the one of the. I would say he did sequence the human genome. His team did it, and kind of shared the credit with Francis Collins and their team at NIH. But we had a raucous interview live in person here, and he talked about the foundational assets of having computing power, that was really unrivaled, and how that allowed them to dominate. I want to take us to the kind of mythology, and some of it mentioned in the book. And I don't know if you know this, but here in San Diego, we have one of the founding fathers of the transistor revolution. In fact, the Nobel Prize winner who shared the Nobel Prize for the invention of the transistor. We don't have his body, but we apparently have some of his, I'll say, genetic material here in what's called the Genius Factory, or perhaps the Repository for Germinal Choice, also known as the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank. And Shockley is a character in this book, obviously. Talk about him. I find him very fascinating. Of course, he was a genius, inventor, although he may not have been as bright. Allegedly, he kind of failed this determined study of IQ by Nobel laureates. But tell me about Shockley and his role, and this mythology that we have of putting these kind of contributors to the technology revolution up on a pedestal, whether financially or intellectually.
Well, Shockley certainly was an important figure in the development of some of the theory, as well as some of the initial inventions that led to the first transistor, and then the ability to produce them at larger scale. But he's also, I think, a great case study in how, if people are focused on getting attention and taking credit for inventions, they can write the history in a way that gives them an outsized role. And so he was actually one of 3 scientists that devised the first transistor at Bell Labs. He actually didn't play the major role in devising it. He played the major role in theorizing it. But there's a very famous photo that was taken right when the first transistor was being announced. And he put himself at the center of the photo, looking through the microscope, and had his 2 colleagues standing behind him as though they were his lab aides. And so he's gotten the lion's share of the credit for the invention. But, I think what's interesting about Shockley is that although the history is generally written with him at the center, in fact, he was a failed business person. He tried to mass produce transistors, couldn't do it. And it was people like Gordon Moore who turned the transistor from an interesting science experiment into a mass market product. And so if you want to look at the technology trend, it's actually less about the scientist who invented it, and more about the person, the people who learned how to mass produce them.
Here at UC San Diego, we had 2 graduates of our university that went on to found an incredible business here called Cymer, and that's Robert Akins and Richard Sandstrom. Talk about, and now they're part of ASML, and you talk a lot about ASML in the book, and how crucial and really monopolistic, and hopefully benevolently monopolistically so. Talk about AMSL and what is so fascinating to you as a not a physicist, but as a writer, as a technologist. Talk about what fascinates you so much about the technology used in this exquisite production of semiconductors that drive the modern world.
ASML is the company that makes the tools that make chips, or makes some of the tools that you need to make a cutting edge chip. And so its job is to produce these machines that can manipulate materials at almost the atomic level, do so at a cost and at volume that is financially viable. That's actually the hard part. The hard part is not the physics, although it's very, very, very hard. Hard part is doing the physics in a way that is viable to mass production. And so ASML has been involved in the lithography industry for now around half a century. But in the early 1990s, when this new type of lithography called EUV, extreme ultraviolet, was being invented, ASML was the only company willing to bet that you could commercialize this technology and turn it into a mass production product. And so they spent 3 decades, billions of dollars, took on huge financial and technical risk to produce these machines. And today they're the most complex machines humans have ever made. They've got inside of them the flattest mirrors ever made, one of the strongest lasers ever deployed in a commercial device, and an explosion happening inside of the chamber that Cymer developed at a temperature of 40 or 50 times the temperature of the surface of the sun. And this isn't a one-off. This is a machine that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it has to work because each one of them costs $150 million a piece. So it's an extraordinary combination of, on the one hand, physics and engineering, on the other hand, making it match the business case that's necessary to produce them by the dozens and eventually by the hundreds.
Hey there, fellow warriors. As we prepare for our chip war with our fantastic guest, Chris Miller, let's make sure we're fully equipped for battle. Building computer chips is a highly specialized and complex task that requires a combination of skills and knowledge from various fields like computer science, electrical engineering, and other fields. Fortunately with Brilliant, acquiring these skills is just a few clicks away. Brilliant is a dynamic and interactive platform, effective for hands-on learning. It empowers you to learn at your own pace and approach problems like a real scientist does. And the best part? It tailors content to your unique learning styles and offers guided, bite-sized lessons to help you master concepts in just 15 minutes a day. With Brilliant, you'll gain the knowledge and skills you need to venture into the chip industry, one of the most promising career fields right now. Ready to take the first step? Check out their Thinking and Code course to lay a strong foundation for computational problem solving, paving the way for their more advanced computer science and programming classes. You can do it on the run, on the app, as I love to do every day, or even on the web. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Dr. Brian Keating, or click on the link in the description below. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Now, back to the battle as we join the chip war. Let's go.
And talk about the challenges of scaling up. I mean, you talk about the feature size on these exquisitely manufactured devices. This one here you could do in a literally in a with optical light and then so forth. You don't need extreme ultraviolet, advanced diffraction gratings and so forth. But talk about limitations. The size scale is approaching fractions of a coronavirus, for scale. I love that that's become a figure of scale nowadays. Tell me, what are some of the challenges of going beyond these already literally microscopic and beyond microscopic levels?
I think one of the things that surprised me was that to make smaller and smaller devices, and as you say, the transistors in the chips on our phones and in PCs are now virus-sized. You need bigger and bigger machines and bigger and more complex supply chains. So when the chip industry was founded, companies would do everything themselves. They'd make their own production machines. They'd refine their own chemicals. They'd produce their own silicon wafers. They'd try to do it all. Whereas today, every step is so mind-bogglingly complex, and the level of specificity and purification and precision is so high that there's not a single company that can do anything on their own. And so the number of firms, the number of countries involved in making a chip inside your smartphone now measures vastly larger than it would have in the past. And just the machines themselves, take a cutting edge lithography machine, they require multiple airplanes to move because they're so large. And then the next generation lithography machine that will make even smaller circuitry will be substantially larger, because to make smaller and smaller devices, you need bigger and bigger machines.
And a quote that I also want to get your reaction to goes like this: "What Gordon giveth, Bill taketh away." That refers to Gordon Moore's Moore's law, but also Bill Gates, with Bill being a proxy for the software the kind of voracious appetite that software has to chew up all these computing resources. In fact, we use in our cosmic data analysis, we use Department of Energy machines that are, benchmark top 5 in the world, or maybe even better. They're used primarily for nuclear fusion simulations and research in nuclear weapons, but they give us some spare cycles. We found that, at least I found, and informally talking to my colleagues, Moore's law might keep increasing, but what I really care about is how many papers, come out of it, right? I don't really care how many flops are done. I want to know, how did you distill this, this technology into floating point operations that then do analysis on the distribution of dark matter in the universe, for example? That kind of benchmark, the ultimate, what I do is to convert money, into papers. Some funding agency gives me a grant, and we work and we get a paper out. Maybe we get 10 papers out for every $10 million. It's about $1 million a paper. Anyway, long-winded way of asking you, is it not true that the better the hardware gets, the software developers take advantage of it, or maybe don't optimize? And so therefore, Moore's law, the effective Moore's law for output, which is what you care about, scientific discovery, gene discovery, all sorts of protein folding, it's actually saturating and not growing anywhere near the power law exponent that Moore's law is. So talk about that, the bill taking away from what Gordon gave us.
Well, I think it's certainly true that we've got an almost limitless appetite for compute. And the more compute we get, the less efficient we have to be with it. The less compute costs, the more incentive we have to be inefficient, because we can spend our time on other things. And so it's absolutely right that in times when Moore's law is improving at a rapid pace, software engineers try less hard to be efficient. I would not agree with the thesis that we're getting less bang for our buck out of Moore's law. I think, in certain spheres you can make that argument, but I guess when I look at the explosion of interest in applications of AI over just the past couple of years, it seems to me that there's a lot of pretty fantastic products coming down the pipeline. And to me, that's a sign that we're finding new applications for Moore's law. And it's only because of Moore's law that you're able to train big AI systems, because they're just so data intensive and therefore just so compute intensive to train. And so there's a big debate constantly underway in the chip industry. Is Moore's law finally dying? What does it mean? How would you define that? But I guess when I look across the use cases for compute, which today the biggest growth driver is AI and autonomous systems, it seems to me there's a whole lot of excitement for the next generation of products and concepts that are being developed.
Yeah, I think that certainly is true. And I guess, the next question is, is the next war maybe not a chip war, but a qubit war? What are your thoughts there? Are we going to witness, really truly exponential growth, even of the exponent in Moore's law? Not just that it's exponential, but it's increasing at an exponential rate. Will quantum computing come to the rescue?
I think it's hard to talk about quantum computing with certainty because the industry doesn't exist yet. We've got companies that are in the very, very early stages of trying to create products. And so we're sort of like in the position of being in 1952, a half a decade after the first transistor was developed, and trying to project forward when the iPhone would be created. We just don't even know, nor can we really conceptualize what the iPhone of quantum computing will be half a century in the future. So we're speculating pretty blindly here. I think you can say, though, is that if you look at the history of classical computing, what you find is that even the really revolutionary changes, they happened incrementally. And so it was a decade between the first invention of the transistor and the integrated circuit, another decade between then and when big mainframe computers became standard in large corporations, another decade after that before the pocket calculator, which was the first real consumer product using integrated circuits, was invented, another decade after that for the PC, decade later for the iPhone. And so it was actually a very long process by which classical computing was applied to all different facets of our economy and our society. And so I think that quantum computing will be similar. It's going to take a long time to sort out, once we've got the technology sorted, what's the economic use case, what's the business use case, and how does that disseminate across society?
And when we look at, kind of the historical parallels with what happened, as you said, 70 years ago now, and fast forward to today, we see parallels playing out. Whereas the U.S. was engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, you make the case that a decisive element of our victory, if you can call it that, was our preeminence in semiconductor manufacture and industrialization. Is that all attributable to capitalism versus communism? In other words, that there was such a profit incentive that the capitalists were destined to win, And if so, does that not bode well? And I'm not, obviously I'm American, so I'm going to take America's side, America first in this instance. So does that bode well for China versus America? Because China is still a communist country. What are your thoughts there? How decisive was communism versus capitalism? And are there historical rhyming, kind of analogies with what we see with China?
Yeah, I think you want to drill it down to its basics. That's basically accurate. It's true that the government played a major role in funding the first inventions that set up the chip industry. The first chips that were produced were basically bought by NASA or the Pentagon. But if you ask, why was it that these initial inventions, which were purchased in very small quantities by the hundreds and thousands, turned into an industry that now sells millions and millions of units each year? The answer is because there was a huge consumer market and a huge corporate market that was opened. And so it's been, although it's been the government that has funded the initial invention, it's been the civilian market that has funded the expansion and has made it possible to lay down the capital investments that make it realistic for firms to keep investing every single year in new process technologies and new machines, new chemicals. That's something that the communist world during the Cold War didn't have. They had the military market. They had lots of spending there. They had the best scientists in the Soviet Union who were basically conscripted into the chip industry. But they had a tiny market, and as a result, they couldn't scale. And scaling is everything. And I think that's basically the same dilemma China finds itself in today. China's trying to build a self-sufficient chip industry because it doesn't want to rely on the United States and Taiwan and Japan for understandable reasons. The problem is that self-sufficiency means you don't have scale. China's a big country, but it's only 20% of world GDP, whereas the rest of the chip industry is selling to 80% of world GDP. And if you're on the wrong side of that equation, it's just very, very hard to keep up.
I never like it when an author, I've been in your shoes being interviewed, the podcast host asks you, could you summarize the entire book, so that people don't have to buy it or even listen to the audiobook or even buy the short form. No. I am not short form. I refuse to do that. But TSMC plays a big role in the book. And I want to see if you can maybe approach it from, maybe I'm being naive. But my first, kind of stance at this is that we have about 200 top universities in the world, and many of them are in the United States. I mean, there's thousands of great universities, but 200 or so have preeminent, not just photolithography, fabrication facilities, but they also have the greatest scientists in the world, in my opinion. My colleagues are, extremely brilliant. Why is it so hard to have, to offshore TSMC and make it, Arizona semiconductor, and it seemed to be to de-risk a lot of the, kind of existential threats that the chip universe is being threatened by with a potential conflict between China and the US. Why not take, just make a Manhattan Project-like effort and onshore into, maybe NATO, I don't know, you can say whatever you like, but why not? Why is it so hard? When my dean gets asked for, $12 million startup, to fund a new lithography machine facility here, clean room class, 300 clean room, they don't balk at it. So why is it so hard? Especially since Cymer is located in America.
Well, it all goes back to the question of scale, really. So TSMC is the world's largest chip maker. Because it's the world's largest, it has lower unit costs because it can drive down the cost of its purchases of wafers and purchase of chemicals. But more importantly than that, it gets economies of learning because it learns for each wafer it fabricates. And so it learns more. It has more chances to learn than any competitor. And so as a result, it's both got really impressive economics, but it's also got the best technology of any other company producing processor chips. And it's been in that position for some time. And what that means is that all of the world's chip designers want to work with it. And so it's got an ecosystem that's been built up around it, whereby all of the companies that design chips want to work with TSMC because it's got the best cost and best technology. All of the companies that make the machine tools realize that TSMC will be their biggest customer since it's got the scale. All the companies that design the software that's used to design chips need to make sure their software lines up with TSMC's practices. And so it's become the platform, so to speak, of the entire chip industry. It's like the App Store. Apple's got iOS and everyone designs their apps to fit in those boxes. And that's basically what TSMC is. And because it's got this immense scale, if you design a product that doesn't fit with TSMC, you miss your biggest customer. And what that means is that if you want to replicate TSMC, you've got to replicate the scale. And the scale is very, very expensive to replicate. So TSMC is going to spend this year between $30 and $40 billion building new chip making facilities. And that's roughly as much as the US CHIPS Act is going to spend over the next 5 years. So the U.S. government wants to build a chip industry. It's going to spend in 5 years what TSMC spends every single year. And that just shows the level of difficulty in trying to build up that scale outside of TSMC. And TSMC hasn't been investing that much for just 1 year. It's been investing huge sums for the past 30 years, which is why it's got more capacity to produce not only the most cutting edge chips, but also less cutting edge chips than anyone else.
So, you convinced me in the book that the advantage in the U.S., even from its earliest days and probably still until now, as I say, with nuclear weapons research being conducted on, giant DOE computers, that the advantage was due to military funding. So, 40 billion, it's a lot of money, but it's, 4% of the U.S. military budget. Why isn't the U.S. military, viewing this, if it is so, and I agree with you, of course, strategically, why isn't there, a 4%, kind of a diversion of military funding into the military? Just military chips alone would seem to be a wise investment. So what are your thoughts there? Could we see do we need the boogeyman like we had with the Soviet Union, or is China such an entity, or will we only, kind of leave it up to private companies? It seems like a great risk to our national security.
But I think it is, and I think that's one of the key reasons why Congress a couple of years ago passed the CHIPS Act, which is intended to revitalize chip making in the U.S. The challenge is that although it's true the U.S. military needs cutting edge chips, and there's chips in every F-35 fighter, for example, that today can only be made in Taiwan, the volume that the U.S. military buys is small, and it's true that 40 billion is just a small fraction of the U.S. Defense budget. But you need 40 billion every couple of years because a chip making facility is cutting edge for a couple of years, and you need another one and another one after that. And so if you're sitting in the Pentagon, you can buy a new aircraft carrier for $10 billion, or you can buy half of a chip making facility. And aircraft carriers stay in operation for half a century, where chip making facility is cutting edge for just about 2 years. And so that's the calculus that led the Pentagon actually to decide very deliberately about 2 decades ago not to produce its own chips anymore. For a long time, they had this confidential fab where they could produce all sorts of chips for the military and the intelligence agencies, but they decided it was just no longer financially viable, and it was better to rely on Taiwan and save that money to buy other types of equipment.
You have a wonderful passage in the book. You talk about chips from Taiwan provide 37% of the world's new computing power each year. 2 Korean companies produce 44% of the world's memory chips. The Dutch company ASML that we talked about builds 100% of the world's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, without which cutting-edge chips are simply impossible to make. OPEC's 40% share of world oil production looks unimpressive by comparison. And actually, I think OPEC has even decreased now. I think U.S. is making more oil than even Saudi Arabia now. Talk about let's do it all men love to do secretly, right? Let's do some wargaming in this book. So let's say Taiwan is attacked by China. I've used these machines about 30% of the time. I've tried to use, a stepper, deep ultraviolet etcher or whatever. It's down for maintenance, and there's a tech in there in a bunny suit, and they're working on it. These things do, just like an F-35. I think we had on Hazard Lee, who's a stealth fighter pilot, wrote a book about that, fighter pilot. We had him on the show earlier this year. And, he told me that there's about 20 hours of maintenance for every 1 hour of flight. And I don't, they're not, maintaining the chips, but just all the system. These machines need incredible, loving, tender care. Could it even be practical in a war game scenario for China to take out, or take over the island of Taiwan? In about a month, they'd be out of raw materials. The machines would be down, and there's only one sole source. They have to take over the Netherlands too.
Well, I think that is part of the dilemma, that if a war were to start, Taiwan's chip fabs would shut down, and they'd be basically impossible to get started up again unless you had the support from the Netherlands and from the U.S. and from Japan. It's the machines, which, as you say, require all sorts of spare parts and expertise that are imported into Taiwan. It's also the chemicals, which largely come from Japan and the U.S. as well, that are ultra precise, hugely difficult to produce, and need to be supplied on a regular basis. So if there's a war, Taiwan shuts down. I think the risk for the U.S. is that if you ask yourself who depends more on chips made in Taiwan, is it us or is it China? The answer is very clearly us. It's, who are TSMC's biggest customers? Apple, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, AMD. I haven't listed a Chinese firm yet. They're all US companies, mostly based in California. And so who would suffer more if TSMC were shut down? Well, that's a really complex and interesting question. If you actually do the economic analysis, you find that China would suffer more because all the iPhones, for example, are largely assembled in China. So in pure GDP terms, China suffers more. But if you ask yourself whose political system is more able to sustain that type of disruption, I worry that the US is less able to sustain it, and China knows it, because China would be looking at the US. Everyone in the US would be looking at their 401ks, which are largely invested in the stock of Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, et cetera, and they'd be cratering. And so I think there's some concern that China might think that although in pure GDP terms, the impact on China is greater, in fact, China might be able, because of its political system, to withstand the disruption, and the US might not.
You mentioned NVIDIA. Well, let's talk about them. As I understand it, they're not really manufacturing, they're what are they, 8,000, whatever they call their chips. It's their design, and then they're outsourced and they're made by TSMC, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And NVIDIA was actually founded right after TSMC was founded. They wouldn't have gotten started up except for the fact that their investors knew they could go to TSMC for manufacturing services. So NVIDIA's never manufactured anything. They only design. They partnered with TSMC from the beginning.
Talk about what you see exciting in the AI space. You mentioned, autonomous driving and stuff like that before. What is most interesting kind of on the horizon, not like futuristic, 100-year quantum, Teslas driving around autonomous. Talk about what excites you in the near term for the chips that you write so intriguingly about.
The key trend in AI has been that the most advanced AI systems require vast increases in data every 6 months. So there's been great empirical work done on the amount of data used to train the cutting edge AI system of each day. And they find that every 6 or 12 months, there's a doubling of data used in AI training. So faster than Moore's law of growth. And so all of the advances in AI that we've seen have been possible thanks to advances in compute that have made this type of vast training possible. And so if you want to project forward trends in AI, it's been pretty clear over the last decade that you can just project forward data training volumes, which means projecting forward compute volumes, and that will give you what the next generation AI system will basically look like. And so there's a really deep interconnection between the types of chips that NVIDIA makes and the types of advances in AI that we've seen. I think the next question is, we know right now what it takes to train an AI system, high-powered GPUs. But as we begin to deploy AI in all sorts of devices, in cars and phones and industrial equipment, you probably need or want different types of chips that are optimized to that specific domain, have the right power to electricity consumption ratio, for example, for different domains. So that's where a lot of focus is right now, and figuring out what's the right hardware specification for AI inference in different use cases.
And another, kind of interesting historical, kind of excursion you go through is Intel. Obviously, we talked about Gordon Moore and his contributions early on, and not just technically, but in terms of his, kind of entry into the zeitgeist, our understanding of power of things that depend on power laws. Of which Moore's law is just one. Talk about Intel and how they kind of lost. I mean, I remember in the 90s, it was like on your computer, you got from Dell or whatever, a big sticker Intel inside. Now it seems like they're, hopelessly far behind. Are they going to be able to catch up, or, are they going to have to pivot into doing some other software services or data storage or something like that? Will they get away or come back to their roots?
Well, one of the big problems that Intel has faced is that the PC market, which, as you say, used to be a real growth driver, has slowed. Now nobody knows what kind of chips in their PC because it doesn't matter. Our chips are good enough. PCs run. They're not exciting anymore. And so Intel still dominates that market, but it's just a less exciting market, not growing anymore. And then Intel in the data center, which is Intel's other big market, has lost out to companies like NVIDIA. It was behind the curve when it came to AI. And so the most recent data suggests that 3 out of 4 dollars spent in data centers past year went to NVIDIA. And Intel and AMD have just been competing for the remainder. So that's a real challenge for Intel. They got to turn around. But the second issue is that they fell behind TSMC when it came to manufacturing technology. They do both design and manufacturing, and they've been lagging TSMC for the past couple of years. Now, it looks like they've got a chance of catching up to TSMC. We'll see if they do, but their aim is to catch up by 2025.
This is the
once they do that,
chip?
18A, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And right now, they say they're on schedule, and so it may be just as good as what TSMC has. But then they've got to match that manufacturing capacity with designs that people want to buy, and they're right up against both AMD and NVIDIA right now for both PCs and data centers, and it's going to be very tough competition.
Another kind of interesting take in the book that I came away with is the importance of immigration to the all-chip story. Obviously, this involves cooperation and sometimes competition between different nations, different philosophies. I read an article recently that talked about how much the tightening of curbs on AI exports to China is going to, really impact not only sales and the bottom line for NVIDIA, but also like recruiting of talent, in both directions. Maybe talk about immigration. Has it been net good? And with limitations on H-1B visas, many of my students and postdocs and so forth have benefited from that, both from China and Southeast Asia. Talk about that. How has immigration figure into the chip war?
My view is that immigration has been central to U.S. success over the past 75 years. If you look at all of the key turning points in the chip industry, you can find immigrants as part of the story. For example, the 8 engineers who founded Fairchild Semiconductor, which is the kind of first Silicon Valley startup in the chip space, 2 of them were foreign born. So that's 25% right out the bat. If you look at the success of Intel, it was about Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce, but it was also about Andy Grove, who was the longtime CEO, who was born as Andras Grove when he was born in Budapest before moving to New York as a refugee. And the same is true today. Look at Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, born in Taiwan before growing up in Kentucky. And so I think there's a very strong pattern. It's basically as strong a correlation as we got with Moore's Law when it comes to immigrants playing a huge role in the chip industry. And it really is a challenging issue today because, as you say, as the U.S. tries to split the chip world into a China-focused world and a rest of the world sphere, it's forcing people to choose sides. And so there's actually been regulations the U.S. has passed that say neither U.S. citizens nor green card holders can work with certain Chinese firms. And there's been reports that certain green card holders have decided to give up their green card to keep working with these banned firms. And so it has had a direct impact. But I think in the long run, the U.S. has still got a pretty strong position vis-a-vis China. If you look at the net immigration flows, there's a whole lot of people coming from China to the U.S. and a much smaller number going from the U.S. or other countries to China. But as you say, the complexity and the small numbers of H-1Bs make it more difficult than it probably should be.
Speaking of China, famed kind of geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's sort of I wouldn't say America bull, but he basically is claiming that China's on the verge of collapse. Their demographics are horrible. I've pointed out I had on Mo Gadot, who worked at Google X for a long time and is a great writer and thinker. And we talked about how even if it's true that they're going to lose net replacement of 300 million people, they're still going to have over 1 billion people for the next 50, 60 years, and there's no chance of America catching up. Perhaps India already surpasses them. But what do you make of Zeihan's kind of analysis that China's essentially, you've written several books on the USSR and their collapse and Putin and Gorbachev. Do you see any parallels? Are they imminently about to collapse, as Peter might claim, or do you feel actually that may be a psyop that they're perpetrating to make us underestimate how powerful they may actually be?
If you look at the history of authoritarian systems like China's, what you find is that they always look pretty strong until the moment before they collapse. And it's very, very hard to predict the moment a brittle system just pops apart. And so when I look at China right now, things look pretty stable, but I think we've got to recognize that the Soviet Union looked pretty stable in 1989 too. And then 2 years later, it was gone. Now, I don't think that's a prediction. I wouldn't bet on that if I were betting on China's future. But I do think Peter's right to say that China's got a lot of real challenges: the demographics, the economics, the confrontation, not just with the U.S., but with all of its key trading partners: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India. If you were to, arrive from Mars and say, which country would you rather be? I don't think you'd pick China.
And we just to pivot back to some of the personalities in the book. So talk about Jensen Huang. He's sort of this iconoclastic figure. Shows up in a biker jacket, has a huge tattoo on his body, kind of like an Elvis kind of cult like guru following. How much of that is to sort of is to blame for their success, maybe, and then. Do you believe that kind of this cult of personality is warranted? I mean, is he that a visionary? I haven't researched beyond what you provided in the book as a description, which I think is wonderful. But talk about him as a person, as a leader, as a visionary. Where do you see how he fits in the grand story of chips, but also of innovators in the kind of Silicon Valley tradition?
You know what? I think he deserves all of the credit he's given. If you look at what NVIDIA has done, it is a series of extraordinary bets that looked wild and reckless when they were made and turned out to be absolutely central to advances in computing. When NVIDIA was founded, and Jensen was one of the 3 co-founders, they co-founded it in a Denny's in San Jose. So it's like this classic kind of Silicon Valley startup story. Their only product was to produce graphics chips for computers. And they did that pretty successfully for 15 years. And then they heard in the early 2000s stories of PhD students at Stanford and Berkeley and elsewhere using their chips for machine learning and AI. And they realized that basically the same designs that were good for graphics were also good for training AI systems. And so they began pouring irresponsibly large sums of money into building out a software ecosystem around the idea of using their graphics chips for AI. At the time, they were criticized for being hugely wasteful, betting on an industry that didn't exist. Wall Street was furious at all the money they were spending. And until last year, it looked like it might not pan out. But over the past 12 months, as we've just seen what large language models in particular can do and realized that basically all of them are trained on NVIDIA's chips, every tech company in the world has been scrambling to get their hands on products that NVIDIA created. And I think Jensen deserves a whole lot of credit for seeing that trend nearly 2 decades in advance of everyone else. And the important part is he not only saw the trend, he was able to stick with it, spend a whole lot of money building it up when most people said it was a crazy idea.
Hey friends, it's me back again with a request for you to win a chunk, not of a silicon chip, but of a meteorite, a real 4.3 billion year old fragment of the early solar system. And all you have to be entered to win each month is join my mailing list at briankeating.com/list. When you do so, you'll be entered to win one of these chunks of space schmutz, the 4 billion year old chunk of our solar system. Maybe not as high tech as those silicon chips that we've been talking about today with Chris Miller, but nevertheless, unique, interesting, and fascinating. I'll send you information about meteor showers and all sorts of other goodies and how you can watch them. So join my mission. And if you have a .edu email address, you'll be automatically entered to win and you'll automatically receive a chunk of space dust. Now back to the episode. But before you forget, visit briankeating.com/list to join my mailing list. You'll receive the hottest news from around the STEM universe once each week on Mondays. Thanks. Back to the episode.
I'll finish up with a couple of questions, both in some way related to cryptocurrency, to Bitcoin. It's been rumored that, something like half the compute, power on Earth is dedicated to Bitcoin mining by itself. And then there's, 20,000 other alternative coins and networks and so forth. I had on Michael Saylor, extremely bullish about it. And, his basic thesis is that, Bitcoin is stored energy, and that's the irreducible kind of undilutable, perfect form of money, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not getting into the Bitcoin thesis, although if you have any hot tips for our audience, let us know, Chris. But in reality, the staggering amount, if it's true that half the world's energy is basically dedicated to compute power, and something like the equivalent of all the U.S. nuclear-powered carrier battle groups worth of energy is devoted to Bitcoin mining, which is a significant fraction. Talk about the prospects for savings or maybe the picks and shovel layer, maybe the energy side of compute, because it costs energy to compute, even to erase a bit, at a fundamental physics of information level, costs energy. And it contributes to waste heat and waste energy, which contributes to the use of fossil fuels primarily. So talk about how do we integrate energy into it? How should we think about things like cryptocurrencies and their I wouldn't say monopoly, but large demand on compute power and energy requirements?
Well, it's absolutely right that this is a key challenge the industry faces and really has faced from the beginning. If you look at why the first decision was made to move from computers based on discrete transistors to computers based on integrated circuits, lower power consumption was a key driver. And so the industry has been driven forward by its ability to produce more power efficient compute. That's been a key demand from customers from the earliest days. And so if you ask yourself, why is it that every year smartphone companies pay a lot of money to TSMC to give them a better smartphone chip? It's because the power to compute ratio tends to get better on a pretty regular basis. And there's trade-offs, more power versus more performance, and the efficiency laws that dictate that power consumption should get better over time have been performing much less well in recent decades than they did in the early stages. But there's a huge focus underway right now in finding ways to make it all more efficient, because as you say, it is fundamentally a key input to compute. And if our demand for compute is basically infinite, and I think it basically is, our supply of power is not. And so we've got to find ways to keep economizing on electricity usage.
Yeah, my favorite, kind of thing to think about quantum computers is that they're extremely good at solving, what's called the Lagrangian for a quantum computing system. They're very good solipsistically at looking at the underlying quantum mechanical equations. And those are governed by things called Lagrangians. And they're very good at finding these minimal energy surfaces and doing path integrals and all these things that Feynman talked about way back when. But they're not, yet found, as you said, scalability, a practical consumer, viable consumer option, et cetera. But my favorite, kind of future optimistic, Pollyannish view is that, quantum computers are going to figure out a way to get high TC superconductivity, which would then reduce the energy draw on compute and almost every other thing that we depend on for our modern technological world. Well, Chris, this has been a phenomenal interview. I thank you for your time. I can't resist asking you one final question. I usually ask when I'm speaking with a Nobel Prize winner, so that shows you the esteem I have for you. This podcast is called Into the Impossible, and it derives its name from Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who said the only way of determining the limits of the possible is to transcend them and go into the impossible. You're a professor. You've written best-selling books. One of the FT's finalists, best book of the year. Give me 20 seconds of advice. You have 20 seconds with your 20-year-old version of yourself. What do you tell him? What do you tell him to give him the confidence to do as you've done, to go into the impossible?
Well, I think, it's a hard question for historians to ask, because our job is to look at things that have already been done. So we already know that they're possible. I think if there's one thing that I guess I've learned, it's about the need to try to connect different disciplines together. I mean, when I started, I had no knowledge of electrical engineering or physics or material science or anything, just a background in economic history. But it turns out that just applying that background to an industry like semiconductors can produce a lot of pretty extraordinary stories and unlock a new way of seeing technology. And so that I think is what I hope made the book pretty interesting. And if there's a lesson that I drew from the research, that's it.
I can't resist asking one final question. It's prompted by Richard Feynman, who is in some ways a founder of nanotechnology, a famous paper. You probably read it, called Plenty of Room at the Bottom. And he starts off that he says, I imagine experimental physicists must often look with envy at a man like Hammerlin Omens, who discovered a field like low temperature superconductivity, which seems to be bottomless, in which one can go down and down and down. Such a man is then the leader and has some temporary monopoly on a scientific adventure. I see a lot of that in this book. It's told so wonderfully. And if I could close with one last question to you, again, inspired by Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the namesake generator of this podcast, after all. And he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I like to think Feynman answered that question once. He said, what statement contains the most information about the physical universe in the fewest words? And he said, basically the atomic hypothesis, that everything's made of little atoms whirling around and bonding and combining together. What do you see as the most magical form of technology? Is it the semiconductor chip? Is there something else that we didn't get to discuss? What form of technology is most akin to magic, in your opinion?
We talked a bit about the ASML lithography machines that that convert tiny balls of tin into light at just the right wavelength, 13.5 nanometers, to bounce off the flattest mirrors in the world and etch tiny circuits on the chip inside of your iPhone. To me, understanding how that machine worked and then understanding how every day of my life I relied on the chips that it produced, that was really a magical discovery. And it's still sort of a shock that machines like that work on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, where can people find you and learn more about your work and your other books?
Fantastic. Well, my website is christophermiller.net.
Chris, thank you so much for your valuable time. I enjoyed it very much. I hope we can speak again in the future, maybe meet up someday.
Great. Thank you, Brian.